Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Thomas Brush and I make indie games for a living. Let's jump inside of Unity and I want to show you how you can create a 2D platformer really fast. Believe it or not, my recent 2D games, whether it's my remake of BioShock or my 2D game that I made for PewDiePie for my 14-day game jam, and I actually got to play it with Felix, those projects were actually created using this basic sort of blank canvas game kit. Okay, and this game kit is actually totally free. I want you to click below, download that game kit to follow along, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with just the core elements of any 2D game. Most 2D platformer games are all going to have basically the same things, and that's what's included in this game kit. So once you actually click that link below, you're going to be sent a link. I want you to go to this link here, and I want you to click code here, this green button. This is on GitHub. And just download the zip file. Open that up in Unity. Make sure you check the README file, depending on when you're watching this video, which Unity version you want to open it up in. In the README file, currently it's 2020.3.19 F1. Before we get into the actual content of this scene, just note that my layout for Unity might be a little bit different than yours. I like to have my hierarchy right here, which is all my game objects for the scene. Then I like to have my project folder. I like to have it sort of stacked and have collapsible folders. Got my console down here, my inspector over here, and my animation tab over here. Okay, let's hit play here and take a look. All right, I'm gonna mute the audio for now. We can attack, we can run, there's parallaxing occurring, there's a camera following the player, there's a level name. You can collect coins and hearts, you can break boxes. There's patrolling enemy types, there's keys you can collect. You can kill the patrolling enemy types. There's also flying enemy types, and there's doors and dialogue systems. Okay, very basic 2D system here. So instead of you coding all this from scratch, why not just have a starting point right away? And again, that's the link in the description. Feel free to download that. It's totally free. Use it however you want and follow along with this video. So let's briefly just go through what's included in this current scene. We have our persistent objects. These are objects that don't get destroyed when you load a new level. That's going to be the player. And also just some startup elements like the game manager and also the HUD, which is going to be just the graphics on a canvas. And there's also a pause menu. It's currently disabled and it's enabled when you press escape. Then we have our level objects here. These are things that are going to destroy once you load a new level, right? We have our scene layers here. And this is really an awesome system. I'm really proud of it, actually. And I'm going to talk about it in just a bit. But we have our scene layers, which include all of our graphics and all of our platforms. And we have a cameras prefab here, which when it's collapsed or expanded, there's a main camera, a virtual camera, which is basically controlling the main camera via Cinemachine, which is Unity's camera system. You can do a lot of cool things with Cinemachine. We're not actually going to do a lot of cool things in this tutorial because it's just the basics of a 2D platformer. But that's going to follow the player around. Then also our music and our ambience, and all they are is audio triggers with a few variables you can control. That's basically it. So let's run through each individual element, and we're going to start with the most important 2D elements and go down from there. Okay? Let's start with our player. Any 2D game, any 2D platformer game should take advantage of what's called a capsule collider. And most of you probably already know how to use this. But the truth is most indie game developers, they don't create everything from scratch. They don't create a capsule collider or a physics system completely from scratch. Rather, they're just going to use out-of-the-box components that Unity has to offer. And so I'm just putting that together here for you in this project file, so that you don't have to do all the work. So here's our capsule collider. I'm going to turn on our gizmos here. So right off the bat, any 2D platformer game is going to utilize a capsule collider and not a square or box collider. The reason why is because if you were actually to push a box up a hill, you'd notice the corner would dig in to the ground that you're pushing it on. The same is true with physics in a video game. That's why you want to have these rounded edges. It's really smooth. It allows us to go up inclines very smoothly, okay? So there's a capsule collider and it's linked to the rigid body, right? That rigid body is going to be what makes that capsule collider actually fall to the ground. Then we have an audio source which plays sound effects through the player. We have an animator which controls various animations like running or standing or jumping or attacking. Let me move my face here and show you. If I move my face over here, you'll notice that I have a bunch of different animations here, like the fall animation, the attack up animation, right? And also the hurt animation, which actually just disables the player's graphics for a little bit, the jump animation, and my favorite, mainly because it takes forever to create, so I'm glad that I have a basic run animation ready to go for you. We have a run animation here, okay? These various animations are controlled with our animator component, okay? So if we select the animator window here, you can see that we have a bunch of parameters. And by the way, if this confuses you, I highly suggest clicking the link below to watch a tutorial on the animator. I love this tutorial, and it's gonna help you better understand how to use the animator, okay? But what I've created here for you is just the basics of any 2D character in a platforming game. So we have standing, we have running, we have attacking, and then the directional attacks here. We have jumping, and then we have falling. These are all triggered based on various parameters, like the velocity X of the player, the velocity Y of the player, whether we're attacking, whether we're grounded, whether we're hurt, whether we're jumping, the move direction, the attack direction in the Y direction, so we can punch up or down. There's a bunch of parameters here that control which animations play. And this is done with these transitions here. And I apologize if you understand transitions, but just for those of you who don't understand, these transitions have these conditions in here, and if the conditions are met, they're gonna play the animation. If they're not met, they're gonna go back to running or back to standing. So just be sure to click around these and take a look at them, and you can tweak them however you like and make your character much more custom and have your own types of attacks using the current sort of canvas I've created here. And I say canvas, it's just a blank canvas for you to paint on and create your own game. That's kind of a metaphor for you. Okay, so we have our animator on our player. And sorting group, we just want the player and all of his sprites that are children here. We want those to be in the right sorting group. And this is the most important script. In fact, I would argue this is the most important script for any 2D game, and that is your player script. I like to call it the new player script, okay? That's just what I've decided to call it, as opposed to player. I think that's a very generic term, and sometimes that can get confusing with other namespaces. Now again, this tutorial is for those of you who understand C#, at least beginners or slightly intermediate understanding C#. The reason I say that is because if you scroll through this, you should be able to look at this script and understand what's going on. And that's because I'm a layman when it comes to scripting. And so there's just generic conditions being met, okay? And I've also left comments here of exactly what's going on. So this is just the basic player script. There's nothing too complicated here, okay? There's nothing specific that won't work with your 2D game. There's a references portion for our variables. And these are all the references to various items in the game, like particles for the death effect, camera effects we can control, an attack hitbox, and we'll talk about that in a second, audio sources, the animator on the player. So these are all just references we can reference with the script and actually make changes to these various components. And down here, and we're going to talk about this singleton instantiation in just a second, right here is the properties, and you can see that it has a header here. These are all of my properties. Whether I'm dead or not, whether I'm frozen or not, what my launch power is when I get hurt, jumping power, max speed. These are all just very generic properties associated with the player's movement. Okay. We also have inventory. We have sounds, all the sounds we want to play. And then the last thing I want to mention before any function fires, before even the awake, before the start, before on enable, this is so important. This is our singleton instantiation. The singleton instantiation allows us to access the new player wherever we are in any script. So for example, if I was in the dialog trigger script, just a random script I'm going to pick here, instead of writing gameObject.find player.getComponent new player, instead of doing it this way, which is the typical way that you access components. Because we have this singleton instantiation, we can type new player dot instance dot, and then whatever variable we want to change inside of the new player script, we can do that. Dot frozen equals false, right? So that is why we're utilizing the singleton instantiation occurring before any functions fire, okay? We're creating this singleton. Now, we're doing this with the game manager as well, and we'll talk about the game manager in a second. But this singleton instantiation and the game manager's singleton instantiation allow us to access these two scripts from any script in the game. So hopefully you can see why you would want to use a singleton for certain classes in your game. Classes that you're going to be using over and over and over again. And I've only done it in two cases. The game manager, and we're going to talk about that in a second, and then also just the new player script. All right, so that's the new player script. Let's talk about what's inside of the player as children. All we've really got here are just sprites, okay? Just a bunch of sprites, the hand, the foot left, the foot right, the eyes, and then most importantly, and this is what I love about Unity's 2D animation system, we have our bones that we can move this sprite or the meshes of this sprite and create various animations. So that's what allows us to have this run animation. It's almost like a 3D model, but it's in 2D. Now, let's talk about how to edit this character's graphics if you want to, okay? What I want to do is actually just go to the actual player Photoshop file. It's right here, it's called player, and you can see it has a little blue box next to it. That's because it's actually a PSB file and not a PSD file. If it was a PSD file, it would generate a little sprite icon right here. But what we've got is a PSB file, and what that means is we can take the layers from the Photoshop file and actually animate those layers. It's really, really cool. Before we jump into how to edit these graphics, I just want to make sure it's clear. The 2D animation system is not included by default in a blank Unity project. It should be included in yours because you're downloading this from my GitHub, but I just want you to know that if you don't see it, make sure you go to Unity registry and type in 2D animation, and you'll see it show up right here, and you can import that. That's going to allow you to import PSB files, not PSD files, PSB files, and animate those files. Let's double click on this just to show you what it looks like inside of Photoshop. This is a PSB file, it's a Photoshop big file. By default, Photoshop is gonna save out your files as a PSD, and that's a Photoshop document file. You really want them to be a Photoshop big file, otherwise that information of the layers and the names, that's not gonna get transferred over to Unity and you won't be able to animate each layer, okay? So we have all of our different layers here, just various pieces for our character. And we even have this little explosion effect for punching or attacking, okay? Now, if I wanted to change the head, for example, if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to make it an orange face, maybe add a little bit of a gradient to it, like this, and maybe add a little nose, and a smile, right? Some eyebrows. If I merge all these layers together and then merge it down, as long as this layer here is named exactly what it was before we made any changes, if I save this, Unity will recognize that and update the graphics on the fly. See that? So if I hit play, you'll see we now have a new graphic for the head. Now, obviously, guys, if you start making crazy changes to the graphics, you're going to need to understand the 2D animation system and creating a mesh and weight painting. You're going to need to understand a little bit of that. And so what I want to do is, well, just point you to a video that I did about rigging in Unity. For those of you who might get into a situation, I'll show you. Let's say if I gave him blue hair like this, if I saved that out, you might get confused because, well, you can't see the hair. That's because you want to make sure you go to the player here, and in the inspector, when you click Sprite Editor, you're going to need to remesh. And I highly recommend watching the video below, and it's going to help you better understand how to do this. Okay, I'm not going to run through everything in this video. Go to the skinning editor here, and you can see here we can generate new geometry. But for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm just going to ignore that. And again, just click below if you're confused about rigging in 2D animation. Okay. All right. So that's the player. Pretty cool. And again, don't feel ashamed if you feel like you're not creating everything from scratch. Downloading this project file is going to save you 3-4 weeks of time because it's all pretty much ready to go, and it's up to you to personalize it and make it fit what you're going for your 2D game. Okay. All right, we're just moving down the line here. We have a startup game object. This is a blank game object. It's basically kind of like a folder, and it holds our HUD. And these are all these different graphics here. We have our dialogue system, which will pop down when you talk. These buttons here. And we also have our UI elements like our coins and our health. And then this right here allows us to put our various keys that we collect or any inventory item we want into this slot here. There's a fader, there's a damage, which the damage just sort of flashes the screen. It's just an image, and then a title that appears. So this should be the way that a lot of 2D games are created. They have a player, they have a HUD, and then they also have, and this is really important, a game manager. And you can see that when you name something game manager in Unity, it gives it a little gear icon by default. Pretty cool. And all this is a script. It can be anything you want it to be. Typically, a game manager is going to hold certain references, and also it sometimes will hold the inventory. Ultimately, the game manager is something that's to help you. It shouldn't be a burden. You don't even need a game manager if you really don't want it. For me, it just stores certain references and a few variables, okay? But overall, the game manager is actually really simplistic here. Just a few references to the HUD, to various audio sources, to the dialog box controller, those kinds of things. So just open up this script and take a look at it. And if you're ever confused what a script does, it's written right up there, okay? All right, and again, this is a singleton, right? So the game manager and the new player are singletons. And this is what this script does. It makes it a singleton. That allows me to reference the game manager whenever I want, right? So I could write, again, just for clarity here, game manager.instance, and then reference whatever I need. All right. Okay, let's move on down the line here. We have our pause menu. Nothing too crazy here. Just a few generic buttons that when you click them, it will continue or restart the level, or you'll quit. These are just the basic core elements of pretty much any pause menu. I'm going to disable that for now. Let's move on to, in my opinion, the second most important aspect of any 2D game, and that is the graphics. Now, the way that I used to make 2D games, and perhaps you've experienced this yourself, you find yourself dragging in all your graphics and your sprites, and you're setting up this beautiful 2D scene. It looks great, but it's a mess. And trying to change it, trying to tweak stuff, trying to adjust the sorting layers is a real pain. What I've created here is something called a Scene Layers prefab. I'm going to open up that prefab by clicking this little arrow over here and show you what we've got. All we have are negative layers. They're just empty game objects. Notice they're all just set to 0 position, 0 rotation, and 1 scale. And then they go up to +6. What is the point of all these layers? Well, it's to allow us to have something called a parallax layer script. And what this does is it simulates parallax. Anything that's negative, the higher, well, I guess the lower the negative number, so layer -6, that's going to move a lot closer to the camera. What does that mean? That means that the object that's on this layer is actually going to move very quickly. If let's say a tree stump was way right here and the player was right here, if the camera was moving with the player, the tree stump would actually move like this, okay? That's what this parallax layer script is doing for us, okay? And you can see we've got a parallax layer script on every layer here, every object. And watch this parallax amount slider here as I go down. See that? Slowly going down to -1. Layer 6 is where you could put something like the sky. It's going to move very slowly in the background. Have you ever noticed that when you're driving on the road, the sun never moves? That's because it's really far away, okay? And that's what layer 6 is. Finally, note that each layer or game object has a sorting group on it as well. And that sorting group ensures that any sprite we put inside of this game object is going to be on layer -6, and the order is 0, okay? Layer -5, notice the sorting layer keeps changing as we go down. And that allows us to just drag and drop sprites into each scene layer. Now if we go back, you'll notice that I've done that here, right? I have very generic graphics here. So for example, in layer 0, this is like the middle layer. This is where the player actually walks. So we have our ground here, and notice that this sprite here actually has a polygon collider. And just for those of you who don't know, anytime you see a green line, it means it's a collider. A rule of thumb for me is if something is interactable with the player, like a box, or an enemy, a coin, the ground, that's going to be on layer 0. That means there's no parallax effect. It just means it's going perfectly relative to the camera, right? Nothing's happening. But you can also see that I've got elements in the foreground. So for example, these black boxes here are on layer -2. That means they're going to move a little bit quicker towards the camera. Don't worry, I'm going to show you this in action if it's confusing you. You'll notice I haven't taken advantage of all of the layers here. I've actually only taken advantage of 5. Layer 5 here is the buildings in the background. And that's just a simple, very simple, tiled, you can see the draw mode is set to tiled. It's just a tiled sprite in the background, okay? Let's show you this parallax in action. I'm going to hit play here. Notice in the game view here, it looks like it's a 3-dimensional world, almost like pieces of paper sort of stacked. It looks 3D with that parallax effect. But notice in the scene view, it's a little bit different, isn't it? In the scene view, you can see the sprites actually moving. They're literally moving, creating that effect. See that? So that is what parallax looks like when you're not actually looking through the lens of the camera. Now, I think it's important to note that there's another way to achieve this without writing parallax scripts or utilizing parallax scripts. And that is if you go to your actual camera, if we go to the main camera and we set it to perspective, well, perspective is going to treat it like a 3D game. So that parallaxing is going to occur naturally by default. The problem is, and without getting into too much detail here, the problem is this actually creates a lot of difficulty in control. I have a lot more control when I'm using an orthographic mode in a 2D game. So I'll just leave it at that. You have a lot more control, and you can try out perspective and see if it works for you. Just make sure you disable those parallax effects. And so the way this works is if you ever want to add a sprite or something to a layer, all you got to do is, well, let me show you. Let's say I've got these cool prefabs here. I've got a breakable box. All I got to do is just drag it to layer 0. There it is. And now the sorting is proper. See, it's behind the ground, but in front of those background objects. So the sorting is set up by default because we put it in the right layer. And also the parallaxing is correct as well. Pretty cool. For example, let's do another one. If I wanted to add something to the foreground, let's say I wanted to add another foreground box here. Let's see if I can select it. There we go. And again, this is a prefab here. If I wanted to do that, I could add it to, let's say, layer 6. There it is. So this box is going to move a lot faster when it's close to that camera. And that's just because, again, of this parallax layer script. And I will open up a few scripts after we run through all of the objects in the scene, okay? But for now, just know there's a parallax layer script that's being controlled by a parallax controller, okay? There's a cameras group. It's really just an empty game object with 3 game objects inside. We have a main camera, we have a virtual camera, and then the camera bounds. The main camera is, like I said earlier, it is orthographic, meaning there's no actual depth. We have to simulate that with a parallax effect. And you can tweak the size if you want. If you wanted to zoom out, you could. But you'll notice that it's not working right now. And the reason why is because the virtual camera, which is a Cinemachine virtual camera, that actually is controlling everything associated with the main camera. So for example, if I want to change the orthographic size, I actually have to do it with the virtual camera. Anytime you're changing any settings with the camera, just know it's probably going to be done through the virtual camera. And again, like I said, the virtual camera is utilizing Cinemachine. And Cinemachine is the camera system that Unity has out of the box. It's a wonderful camera system. There are so many cool things you can do with this camera system. But fortunately for you, the game kit has it all set up properly, so you don't need to worry too much about all these different settings, okay? But feel free to tweak these, change them if you want. But in my opinion, just keep them the way they are, and you'll be good to go. All right, and then finally we have our camera bounds. The cool thing about a camera bounds is it's just a polygon collider with trigger set to true, and you can edit that collider and say, hey, you know what? I want the camera to actually go all the way over here. Pretty cool, huh? I want it to be able to go all the way up here. But it's gonna stop when it hits these boundaries. So that's a really effective way to create a camera boundary, and that is linked to the virtual camera here, okay? And you can see here we have a Cinemachine confiner right here. And then we dragged in the camera bounds right here, and it's going to hit that bounding box, okay? Finally, we have music and we have ambience. These are both set to autoplay. See that tick box there? They're just set to autoplay, meaning they're gonna start up. The ambient sounds of the city are gonna start playing, and then the music is gonna start playing with a fade speed of 0.1, and it's going to loop, okay? Now, if you wanted it to only start, let's say you want the music to start once you've hit a certain location, you can actually say autoplay is false, but make sure you open up or turn on that box collider down there and make sure it's set to trigger. And let's say we want to move it to the zone over here. Now when they walk into this box, it'll start playing the music instead, okay? All right, so that's the basic layout of all the game objects and what they do for demo level here, okay? Here is the best part. Before we move on to the scripts and all the other prefabs and objects we have in our project files, I want to make sure you understand how to change the graphics of the actual game. This is where you're going to realize how powerful this kit is. If you open up, anytime you want to open up a sprite, by the way, just click the sprite, and then you'll see that it's probably going to be, at least in my game kit, it's actually part of this big PSB file. Again, I love using PSB files. Unity is able to interpret all the layers of the PSB file. So I'm going to double click on this and show you. Check it out. In this scene, we've got all of our scene graphics. Everything we use in the game, except for like the enemies and like the UI, everything's in this one scene. So what I love to do is have each level have its own PSB file. You might be curious, what's the size of this PSB file? Well, you can go to Image, Canvas Size, and you'll notice it's basically 4K, but times 2, at least in the width, right? It's 3840 times 2, which is 7680, with a height of 2160, which is 4K height, 2 times 4K width. And this allows us to have a bunch of 4K graphics that are detailed, and it's so cool. I love this because let's say I want to change the way that the ground here looks. If I want to do something like this, maybe I want to add some texture to it. What about some bricks here? These are some bricks that I like to use in my games. Throw in some bricks, maybe some gradients. Let's do this really quick here. Cool, look at that. That's awesome. Let's flip it up like this. Sweet. So if we wanted our ground to look like this, all you've got to do, and this is important, make sure, if I saved it now, you'll notice we have all these random layers. Unity is going to be like, I guess I'll just make sprites out of every layer. What you want to make sure you do is you merge all of this together, but make sure the name was the same. Now obviously you can create additional layers if you want. You're just going to need to make sure you edit those in the sprite editor and cut them out. I'll show you how we're going to do that. All right, I'm going to save that. That's ground 1. And we're about to have a whoopsie moment here. Let me show you. I don't know what a whoopsie moment is. It's when there's a whoopsie, okay? So let's let that import, and you'll notice, oh my goodness, something happened. My sprites are gone. Well, let's open up ground 1 and take a look. Look, it says we're missing a sprite. Sometimes this happens. Don't freak out. It's totally fine. All you do is you go to your PSB file, click on it, and then in the inspector, take a look at sprite editor. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Looks like we have our sprite here. Okay, so we're good to go. Sometimes the sprite might be a little too tall if you've made some edits. Make sure you just pull that sprite up like that, okay? Sometimes it might be too wide or the position's off. Just make sure you clean up this sprite bounding box. Basically all this is going to tell Unity is where do I want this sprite to cut, okay? The name's right, it's ground 1, okay? Let's hit apply. And click X. And you can see we're still missing that sprite. So let's collapse or expand the city PSB file. And down here are all my sprites, okay? So let's just drag it in. Great. Okay, that's working perfectly. Notice we have a sort of new collision part here, a little ramp. So I'm going to add that to my collider. Now because this is a prefab, it's really that easy. Now all of them are updated. Look, we have all these pieces of ground over here. So it's so cool because if you went into this city and made it look gorgeous, changed all the graphics, made beautiful sky, and then brought it back into Unity, tweaked the sprite bounding boxes, made sure you put those sprites into any missing fields, everything's going to update, and you're going to have a beautiful, beautiful city. I did this for BioShock. My remake of BioShock, my remake of Skyrim. I did this for PewDiePie's game, Zero Deaths. It works every time. So if you want to change out these graphics, again, just open up the city file, city.psb. You can name it whatever you want, and then update those prefabs. That's the benefit of working with prefabs. Anything, again, most of you know this, but anything that's blue here, any blue text, that's a prefab, right? And inside of those prefabs are more prefabs. So if you want to edit one prefab, it's going to edit a lot of the other ones. Okay, let's move on to the code base. Okay, we've run through a few pieces of code, but I just want to make sure it's clear kind of what the hierarchy of the code is, where they're stored, and the most important pieces of code. Now, again, this tutorial is not for people who don't understand code. If you don't understand C#, you might want to get an understanding of C#. Click the link below to get started. But what I've got here, for those of you who understand intermediate code, you can see we have, I think maybe 20 scripts here. Nothing crazy, but the most important ones are stored in the core folder here, okay? Dialogue. And we'll talk about how to write dialogue in a second. The dialogue box controller. Game manager. New player. New player is huge. Recovery counter and startup, okay? There's also interaction scripts like an attack hitbox. That is this right here. If we go to the player, you can see we have this polygon collider. It's currently disabled. That's because we don't want the hitbox to hit enemies all the time. We only want it to appear when the player punches. So when this box appears, it can hurt enemies. And that's all done through the attack punch. So you'll see here, look, the box appeared. So we can control where exactly the hit range for the player is. We're not controlling it with code. We're actually controlling it with this box collider here. We have audio triggers, bouncers, things you can bounce on, breakable objects like boxes, and you can actually extend these to other things like lamp posts, barrels, pots, that kind of thing. Collectibles, which include 3 kinds: inventory, coin, health, and ammo. That's 4 actually. Dialogue trigger, and you get the point. There's a ton of different interaction scripts. Feel free to dig through all of these. Each one has comments in each script. So you can take a look at all the different comments that I've written to get an understanding of what each one does. All right, we've got some other scripts here. The animator function script you will use a lot. This allows me to put animation events down here and do different effects like emit particles or shake the screen or play a sound. That's because on the player we have an animator functions script. And this script has all these cool different functions. Hide players. You can actually jump the player with the animator events. So these just allow us to fire functions using the animator events in the animation timeline. And you can create any custom ones you want and just use them by creating a new event down here and then select the function in the animator function script. Pretty cool. I use that all the time, even with like footsteps, right? If I'm running, look at all these different events I'm using from the animator functions script. Play step sound occurs. See? Pretty cool. It even emits particles as well. And those particles are right here. They're called particle step. If I set the emission to 10, I can show you what they look like, right? So pretty cool. You can control that with the animator functions script. The parallax, we've already talked about parallax controller and parallax layer. These are some pretty complicated scripts, I'll be honest, and I don't really know what they mean anymore. And I'm not too worried about it, and I don't think you should worry about it either. If they work, they work, and don't stress too much. A lot of these scripts I don't understand anymore, and that's totally fine. What happens with me is I'll Google something, find out how to do it, and then I'll forget. But I'll just keep using that code over and over again. All right, and then we also have some UI scripts here as well. But like I said, all you got to do is open up these scripts to take a look at what they're doing. Because I'm a layman, I write in very basic coding, and I just use basic conditions, if-then statements. Nothing too crazy here. So feel free to open up those scripts and take a look. All right, let's talk really quickly. And this is the last thing I want to discuss when it comes to this demo scene here. Okay, so let's take a look at how this dialogue system works. It's very simplistic. Basically what you do is you just run over to a character, or it doesn't have to be a character, it could be a locked door, and press E, and there you have it. He says, "Hi there, I'm an NPC and this conversation is called character A. If you go and find me 80 coins, my dialogue will move on to character B. Feel free to edit my dialogue in the dialogue CS file. To keep it simple, you can also ask me one and only one question. So if I select let me go find some coins, it'll close out the dialogue. Or if I choose the dialogue object on the right, I can ask a question. Cool, like this? Great job. When you do that, I'll just move on to the next sentence. I'll answer that question, but it's not going to change much about the game. You can always tweak the dialog box CS script to add more functionality." So as you can see, very simplistic dialogue. But how on earth do you write that in a text file or a CS file? Well, let's open up the dialog CS script here. And you can see this is our dialogue. All this is a public dictionary, okay? And we just add all these different characters or locked doors. In this case, I want to cover what this NPC's dialogue looks like as a script. It's actually very, very simple. Right here we have character A, and then we have character B. Think of the letters after each name as parts of one conversation. So we could really call this John A and John B. John A talks about what his functionality is and that he wants 80 coins. When you find 80 coins, John B will fire, hey, you found 80 coins. See that? But we're going to keep it at character A and character B. So this is the entire conversation. You'll notice that when we were playing, it cuts off right here and throws us these options or these choices. So how on earth does that work? Well, look at the name here. Character A, which is this identical string here, and then choice 1. All you got to do is write choice 1 and choice 2 after the name when you're creating a new dialogue entry, and then just keep it blank. If they're blank here for each entry, it's not going to show any choices. And then for the 5th line here, which is right here, it shows those choices. Really simplistic here, very basic. Anytime you choose the choice 2, it's going to continue the conversation here. That's about it. All right, so that's how the dialogue works. And just note that with dialogue, if we go to this dialogue object here, there's a lot of cool different options inside of the dialogue trigger. Take a look. This is the fetch quest section here, and this allows us to get a chair if we bring him 80 coins. See that? Now in the case of this demo, I think the idea was the chair is something you can use to advance to the next level, right? After you've collected 80 coins throughout this whole level here. But he could give you a key. And also you can choose what the item is and what the sprite looks like so that it appears on screen right here. So this is where you can do all your cool fetch quest things. There's just a ton of cool stuff, even a get sound that can play when you get an item. But you know, sometimes dialogue is just for world building or story building, and it doesn't have to be a fetch quest. Ultimately, we have a very basic system here. And I think most importantly, we do have enemies, and those enemies just patrol. And then we also have flying enemies as well. Be sure to take a look at those scripts as well. But I honestly recommend keeping them as is as you're creating your game, and tweak them when you feel like you're more comfortable with C#, because those two scripts are actually a little bit more complicated. All right, as we close up this tutorial, guys, we have a folder of scenes. Now we just took a look at demo level, but I just want to make sure you know that we also have a logo intro scene, which just fades in your logo. Currently it's just a white square, but you could drag your sprite onto that logo, and then it's going to load the menu here. So we're currently on this menu. It's just two very simplistic buttons. You can click start game or quit and it'll close the application. And when you click start game, it's going to load up the cutscene, right? In this case, I've just put my full-time game dev logo here for my online program, but you get the idea. After the cutscene, it's just going to load your first level. Anyway, guys, I highly recommend taking a look at this game kit and downloading. It's going to make things so much easier for you. All of this took me a long time to create. It took me about a month full-time putting together this system. So if this sounds like something you're interested in, download it now. Totally free, my treat to you. Use it for commercial use, or you can just use it for your personal projects. Doesn't matter to me. And be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and any comments or questions below is totally fine. I'll talk to you later. Bye.